Welcome back to another video, folks. I wanted to take a little mid-July farm walk and farm tour and just show some updates from around the farm as we transition from the early part of the season into late summer and how things are going to move forward into fall. Before getting into the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos, like the video if you like it, and make sure to leave a comment. The gardens, more than any space, are really transitioning from the early part of the season into late summer crops and already starting to seed some fall crops. I've been really happy with some of the interplantings. If you remember from an earlier video, we've been experimenting with multiple types of interplantings, and mostly I've been very pleased with the results on the timing and getting one crop in and another one coming to fill its place just in the nick of time. So without missing a beat, this bed has gotten 3 crops with no time cropless. Started out with cabbage, as I said in my earlier video. Put tomatoes in between a grid of 4 cabbages, and then planted basil along the sides, which we got our first harvest off this morning. Also working with multiple crops planted at the same time in a bed, working with these tight spaces and getting successions in without planting too much. So we've got scallions on the left side here that have come up real nice, and on the right side 2 rows of watermelon radish that this bed should all be ready about the same time, but not be too much of one crop all at once. These carrots in this no-dig system have been really taking off in the last couple weeks, really hitting their stride. Lots of green growth, really beautiful plants. Starting to dig them up and seeing some nice carrots coming on, but still have a few weeks left. But yeah, you can see multiple successions. The carrots are looking quite beautiful. Okra. Okra was a bit late this year and seemed to be somewhat stunted by growing alongside basil, because as soon as we harvested out the basil, it's probably put on a foot of growth in the last week. We're growing this Zephyr patty pan, which we have to pick every 2 days. There's 4 beds planted to it, each 50 feet long, and picking every 2 days we get about 50 to 100 pounds per picking easily. So very productive plants. They're starting to be on their downturn, which is quite all right because we need space for fall crops to come in afterwards. Bit of scrap heap corn. This was somewhat of a marginal space that we had a ton of crabgrass and Bermuda grass in, that we've planted marigolds and herbs, mixed flowers, just along the edge of the barn here, finding places for beauty in some of the marginal spaces on the farm. Look at that, there's a hummingbird in the tithonia right there. You might not be able to make it out, but they've almost turned into a tree. It's buzzing with life. So, just bought a bush hog for the farm last week, and until we get ruminants on the farm, it's going to be a necessary step in periodically bush hogging the pastures. We're doing so in a timed and methodical way, to keep the grasses from being stressed out, so allowing them to get to the same point on their growth curve as if we were grazing them for maximum root development. Clearly it's not as good for the grass as having ruminants on it, but doing our best to avoid mimicking overgrazing mechanically, and also to avoid different pasture weeds that we've seen pop up from going to seed. So trying to time it well and trying to get ruminants on the land as soon as we can. But right now the cattle market is about as high as it's ever been, so local prices adjust to that, and especially with some of the less common heritage breeds that we're interested in for cows, it's been tricky to find an economically viable source of small breeding herd. So that's got us thinking along different terms. We initially didn't have much interest in raising sheep early on, but they seem to be unaffected by the market like cows are, and you can get a small herd of 10 or so breeding sheep for a pretty reasonable price, about cheaper in some cases than the price of a single cow. You can get 10 sheep for, both a ram and bred ewes to get started with. So we're thinking about maybe going that route this fall, and in either case are very excited to get some ruminants grazing all this beautiful grass. Where I am right now is where the chickens had run through the previous batch, and the growth is just of a completely different nature than where they haven't been. And it's really interesting to see both how the grasses respond as well as what species seem to thrive in particular after that single impact with the broiler chickens. Hey chickens. These guys just went out onto pasture 4 days ago, 5 days ago, and they're adjusting quite nice. In these Salatin pens early on, you've got to be really careful moving them for the first couple days because they're just little babies that aren't familiar with the daily routine. But we found that by day 5 or 6, maybe even sooner, they start to know the daily move is coming and expect it, and still have to be careful to not crush any of them moving too fast, but not much of an issue after that period. The trees are looking very good. We've had some stressful conditions, including really heavy damaging rains and Japanese beetle infestations coming through, not just here, but in a lot of places across the county I've seen. Just recently took inventory of all the trees that we planted in the spring to get a sense of mortality and start the process of planning for new trees to add on to and replace our plantings next spring. And we've only seen 5% mortality across the whole farm, which is really good. There's a little pawpaw that seems quite happy. And we're just gonna pop in trees that are quite vigorous in the replacement spots, like mulberry and hazel, and we've gotten the bulk of the plantings down, so we can start to integrate more trees that friends give us and that are super locally adapted, that just kind of find their way to us over time. There's a little basswood tree down there. And you can see the cover crop is mixed in with some grasses, and this is probably the most prevalent thing I'd call a weed out here, is this ambrosia leafed ragweed. But very thick clover, and pretty happy with the germination and succession of the cover crops since we planted them, going from tillage, radish, daikon, and mustards in the spring into really thick swards of red clover and white clover coming through. I think by whatever means is available, it's important to not let the grass get out of hand as these trees are establishing. I think that really tall grass and weedy pastures can harbor good conditions for a whole variety of rodent and mammal pests for these trees that, we're not trying to encourage those populations to thrive, particularly as these trees are establishing. We have protection around the trees, but there's enough voles and field mice and rabbits out here. I have a feeling that they would find the little spots where they could go in and girdle some of the bark and damage some of the trees, perhaps if they're voles, even damaging some of the roots. We've been fortunate to not really see any mammal damage, even though there's healthy deer populations around here, and they may stumble upon these trees sooner or later. But between the cages and the ample fodder for them outside of this really open, vast area with a lot of activity, they don't seem to be interested in the trees so much. We had some friends out last week to help cut paths for more permanent pig paddocks. So I went through and flagged out where the T-posts are gonna go and staged them. And so in this strip of woods, we are setting up 4 paddocks that are each about 60 by 200 feet, a little bigger in some spots. And we're gonna install gates at that fence side between each paddock, so that the point where the gates are, the reason for that is if the pigs are used to there being gates there, they don't see the gate as a threat like they do with a hot electric wire. So as intuitive as it may seem to just have some insulated handles and open the hot wire when you're ready to move them, the pigs learn that that's not a safe space, and it can be really challenging to coax them across a line that they've associated with getting shocked, even if the line isn't there anymore. So for ease of movement, we'll be putting in some gates so that they can just go from one paddock right to the next without having to think about it too much. And we're getting 10 pigs in late August to go through into the winter, and we're excited to be scaling this enterprise a little bit. Our plan as it stands right now is to run 10 to 15 at a time through these woods, rotating them weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the time of year and how many pigs we have on the farm. We're going with T-posts and polywire as the fencing right now. It's somewhat of a semi-permanent solution. I'm hesitant to put in more permanent fencing, primarily because we still want to selectively thin a significant number of the trees and the stems in here. And I'd rather be able to just take up the polywire when there's not pigs on the farm or when they're in a distant paddock and drop trees without worrying about damaging nicer, more permanent fencing. So perhaps in the future we'll invest in more permanent fencing, but it's been my experience and observation, as well as that of a lot of farmers I've spoken with, that as long as the electric is hot enough and the pigs are trained and have plenty to be stimulated, it's not too hard to keep them in a fairly simple setup, as long as you're observing and monitoring and making sure there's no way or reason for them to get out. Just staging materials. Been fortunate to have a lot of fencing infrastructure already here on the farm. It's been just a matter of digging up T-posts and moving old subdivisions, but so far haven't had to buy much in the way of fencing just because of what's been laying around. These 2 trees in the foreground there. The one on the right is a big southern red oak. And the one on the left, nearly rivaling it in size, is an American persimmon. One of the larger ones I've seen around here, and certainly the largest on the property. And it's a male persimmon, so they spread a lot of pollen, but don't set fruit. With that little bit of observation, we decided to plant this patch of the pasture into a persimmon grove. They're all doing quite well, with the thought that the male pollination from uphill and upwind would come down and pollinate these persimmons. And we've observed something very interesting happening all over the farm, and that is volunteer persimmons coming up in just about every patch that we've neglected to mow for maybe a month. Just right over here is one such example. Birds and possums and any kind of critter that is ingesting persimmon seeds are planting them all around. And we're now seeing these coming up, mowing around them, and allowing some of these volunteer persimmon patches to come in. We came here and with our tree plan planted production trees and various natives that are fruit and nut bearing that we know would do well for the general climate and ecoregion and zone that we're in. But it's been really fascinating watching on this particular farm what trees are coming up as volunteers more than any other. If we were to walk away from this place and not farm it, it wouldn't take too long for it to turn into a poplar, persimmon, and walnut forest. But as we observe that, we can pick certain trees that we want to encourage to grow and flourish and manage the rest as a farm. And over time, this pasture landscape is going to evolve more into something that looks like what we call the park behind me. It's kind of this park-like part of the farm with some mature trees spaced out pretty far apart, really vigorous grass growth. And it's kind of like a reminder every day walking between the house and the parts of the farm that we work in. There's this space that looks like we're aiming for the rest of the farm to look like in 20, 30, 40 years. So it's a beautiful reminder of the daily efforts and what we're aiming towards in terms of how we want this landscape to look. The brooder is empty for another week or two until the next round of chickens come. And we are just piling fresh litter right on top of the existing litter from the last batch, putting down fresh shavings and spraying it with a bit of water, and also spraying some effective microorganisms on there. I can leave a description, a link to what that means and what it's used for. And then just stir it around a bit and encourage a bacterial breakdown of any of the ammonia that's built up and any of the potentially harmful bacteria. And there's absolutely no smell whatsoever. We've noticed absolutely no ill health effects in any of the chickens so far. So rather than scooping out all the material in between each and every batch, we're just piling it right on top. And at the end of the season, we'll scoop it all out and have a large amount of material to compost. Turkeys are arriving next week, and you've got to have a separate brooder for turkeys because they're susceptible to a number of diseases that chickens host. So this is a completely separate space. I cut some holes in the wall and just jerry-rigged a couple of these fans to have some air circulation. That one is blowing air out and that one's blowing air in. And it's at a height where even when they're both running, it's well above the level of where the turkeys are. The trick with turkeys and how to avoid respiratory issues in the brooder is to have air circulation but no draft. And so our hope with this setup is to have air constantly moving keeping any stagnant air and any mildew formation, anything like that, while keeping them free from having air blowing on them, causing them to get too cold and perhaps sick and more susceptible to disease and illness. So we're gonna have a little over 100 turkeys in here next week and keep you updated on how the turkeys are doing. It's our first time raising turkeys and we're very excited. That's it for today's video. Just a little tour here in July. We're excited as the season starts to shift into what's my favorite time of year, late summer and into early autumn. We're in a bit of a little summer lull, which has been really nice, especially as we plan for our future years to rely more heavily on the shoulder seasons and take a bit of time in the summer to relax. So coming out of this little lull in activity, we're getting turkeys on the farm, we're perhaps getting sheep on the farm, pigs are coming in just about a month, and the broilers are rocking, and the fall vegetable garden is going to be coming in really nicely. So excited for all that.